The night shimmered under the opulent chandeliers of New York's Plaza Hotel ballroom. The air was filled with the low hum of polite conversation, the clink of champagne glasses, and the rustle of designer gowns sweeping across the marble floors. It was the city's most anticipated charity gala, where the elite gathered not just for a cause, but to be seen, to be recognized, to reaffirm their status. Eleanor Hayes entered quietly, her footsteps almost lost amidst the bustle. The simplicity of her presence contrasted starkly with the extravagance around her. She was dressed in a modest, cream-colored linen dress that hugged her figure in a way that could only be described as understated elegance. No flashy diamonds, no bold logos. Just a woman who seemed to belong to a different world entirely, one that was slowly fading into the background of the high society spectacle. Across the room, her husband, Charles Hayes, stood beside his mistress, Valerie DuPont, the young and vibrant social media influencer who had quickly become the face of Hayes and Lawson, the luxury fashion brand Eleanor had built. Valerie was draped in a glittering gold gown, a custom-made creation that practically screamed for attention. Her arm was entwined possessively around Charles's, both of them basking in the spotlight. The contrast between Eleanor's quiet poise and Valerie's ostentatious presence was striking, and it didn't go unnoticed. As Eleanor moved past them, Valerie's eyes flicked over her with a mockery that was sharp enough to cut through the thick air of high society. With a voice loud enough for several reporters and donors nearby to hear, she scoffed. "Oh, sweetheart, did you sew that little dress yourself?" A ripple of laughter followed, polite yet condescending, like a wave crashing over her. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't even look at them. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed ahead, as though she were walking through a room full of strangers, because in many ways she was... Charles, standing beside his mistress, barely managed to suppress a smirk, his eyes darting quickly toward Eleanor. The pity in his gaze was unmistakable. To him, she was nothing more than a forgotten wife, relegated to the sidelines of a life he was now eager to reshape with his younger, flashier companion. But what none of them knew, what no one in the room could have possibly guessed, was that the woman in the simple dress wasn't just a forgotten wife. Eleanor Hayes was the founder and majority owner of the very brand that the mistress, Valerie, thought she was the face of. Eleanor's quiet presence masked a power that no one in that room had yet reckoned with. In less than an hour, the truth would unfold, turning the entire ballroom upside down. Eleanor took a seat near the back of the ballroom, her back straight, her hands folded gently in her lap. She looked at the sea of people mingling, laughing, making small talk, all of them unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The reporters' cameras panned across the room, capturing moments of fleeting smiles, whispered words, and the constant rhythm of the wealthy and the powerful. She allowed herself to blend in, just for a moment, let them see her as the invisible woman in the corner, the one they could ignore. As she sat there, her thoughts wandered back to a time when this room, this world, had been hers. Back to the early days of Hayes and Lawson. Back to the quiet apartment in Brooklyn. The small studio where the first designs had been crafted by her hands alone. In those days, it had been about quality over status, about creating something lasting in a world obsessed with logos and flash. She had built it all from nothing, poured her soul into every design, and created a brand that stood for something beyond just profit. But somewhere along the way, the business had changed. Charles had changed. The flashback was brief, yet vivid. It wasn't the first time she had revisited those memories. The quiet moments, late at night, when she'd sketch out ideas in her notebook, while Charles worked late on the company's financials. Those moments now felt like they belonged to someone else. She'd been there. She'd seen it all happen. How his business acumen had slowly overshadowed her own creativity. How he had slowly taken control of the company they'd built together. It had all seemed so subtle at first. Just a few decisions here and there. A few meetings she hadn't been invited to. Some new investors brought in. More and more the creative process was pushed aside, and the business side took over. She had thought it was temporary, that it was just a phase. After all, they had a child together, and she wanted to be present for him, to build a family while he took the reins of the company. But it had turned into something else, something far darker. Back in the present, the gala continued around her, oblivious to the storm gathering in the shadows. Valerie, ever the center of attention, turned her gaze back to Eleanor and made her move. "I have to say," Valerie said, loud enough for the few reporters lingering near her, "I'm really not sure why someone would choose to wear something so plain. This is a Hayes and Lawson event, after all. You'd think the ex-wife of the founder would know better." There was laughter again, but this time Eleanor's calm didn't waver. She met Valerie's eyes for the briefest moment unflinching. Then, in a voice soft yet firm, she said, "I like simple." Valerie laughed loudly, a sound that didn't match the coldness of her expression. "Simple is one word for it," she said, turning to the group of onlookers. "But imagine showing up to a fashion event in something you could buy at a farmer's market." The laughter was louder this time, and cameras flicked to Eleanor, capturing her discomfort, or what they assumed was discomfort. But the truth was, Eleanor wasn't humiliated. Not yet. She knew something they didn't. It was almost time for the world to know what she had been quietly planning for years. As the evening wore on, the conversation in the ballroom shifted, whispers beginning to circulate, reporters starting to pay more attention to the quiet woman in the simple dress. And then a fashion journalist named Simone Park approached Eleanor, eager for her scoop. "Eleanor, it's been so long. Can you tell us about your dress tonight?" Simone asked, her curiosity piqued by the simplicity of Eleanor's attire. Eleanor gave a small, knowing smile. "It's one of mine," she said simply. Simone's eyes widened, then narrowed. "From Hayes and Lawson?" "From my personal archive," Eleanor clarified, leaning forward slightly. "It's actually a prototype. Never went into production." Simone's interest skyrocketed. "Wait, prototype number 7? She asked, her voice thick with excitement. Eleanor nodded. "You have a good eye." Simone's heart raced. She turned to the camera, her excitement barely contained. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we just uncovered the story of a night." As the story began to spread, the room buzzed with energy. Eleanor's quiet confidence had triggered something monumental. The reporters swarmed her, asking questions, demanding answers. The press realized what no one else had. Eleanor wasn't just the ex-wife. She was the founder, and she wasn't done yet. And as the night unraveled, Eleanor Hayes would reclaim her place in the world, but not through the flash and spectacle of high fashion. She would do it on her terms. Quietly, strategically, and with the power she had held all along. The stage was set. The next chapters will reveal the consequences of her quiet patience, her emotional strength, and her relentless pursuit of what was hers. Eleanor's revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet, undeniable truth. And tonight, she would make the world see it. The atmosphere in the ballroom grew heavy as whispers swirled, amplified by the flashing cameras and excited murmurs from the crowd. Eleanor's revelation had set the room into motion. Simone Park's live broadcast was already circulating the truth. Eleanor Hayes, the quiet woman in the simple dress, was still majority owner of Hayes and Lawson. She wasn't just a forgotten wife. She was the very heartbeat of the brand the Mistress was so eager to claim. Eleanor sat still, unmoving, as the scene around her shifted from casual gossip to full-blown media frenzy. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, their astonished expressions, but she refused to let their surprise affect her. This was the moment she'd been quietly preparing for, the culmination of years of strategy and patience. The truth was finally out, and there was no turning back. Charles had been too consumed with his new life to notice the cracks forming beneath his feet. Valerie, too, had basked in the glow of a role she didn't deserve, convinced that she was the future of the brand. But Eleanor had never truly disappeared. She had just been waiting for the perfect moment to return, to remind them all who she was and what she had built. As the reporters swarmed around Eleanor, their questions became a blur of excitement and speculation. She answered them all with quiet confidence, her tone even, steady, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. She hadn't, but she had prepared for it, prepared for every eventuality. And now she was in control. Simone Park was the first to speak up again, this time, her voice sharp with realization. Eleanor, can you confirm that you're still involved with Hayes and Lawson? Is this dress a new collection preview? Eleanor smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. I've always been involved, she said. I've just been quieter about it. The simplicity of her statement hung in the air, and for a moment, the noise of the gala seemed to quiet. The truth was undeniable. Eleanor Hayes, the founder, was still at the helm. The people who had written her off, who had relegated her to the background, had no idea how deeply she had been involved in every aspect of the brand's success. They thought they had erased her, but the reality was far different. Simone's eyes widened in disbelief. You're still designing? She asked, almost in awe. Eleanor nodded. I never stopped. She paused, looking directly into Simone's eyes. I just decided to step back. Let others think they knew better. The room fell into an almost unnatural silence as the implications of her words settled over the crowd. The mistress, Valerie, still trying to cling to the narrative she had so carefully constructed, looked stricken. The reporters' cameras flashed like lightning, capturing the realization spreading across the faces of everyone present. Eleanor's quiet strength was palpable. She was no longer invisible. She was taking back her narrative one word at a time. As the news continued to ripple through the ballroom, Charles, who had been hovering in the background, finally pushed through the crowd to reach Eleanor. His face, usually composed and confident, was now a mass of confusion and fear. He had underestimated his wife, underestimated the depth of her involvement with the company. And now, in front of everyone, he was about to learn just how wrong he had been. What are you doing, Eleanor? Charles hissed, grabbing her arm in an attempt to pull her aside. His grip was tight, urgent, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She was calm, composed, and utterly unmoved by his attempt at control. I'm not playing a game, Charles, she said, her voice quiet but full authority. I'm taking back what's mine. The camera flashes intensified as reporters pressed in closer, capturing the tension between the two. Charles's face turned red with anger, his earlier arrogance now replaced by desperation. He had built a life in the shadow of Eleanor's success, using her absence to position himself as the mastermind behind Hayes and Lawson's operations. He had thought he could erase her legacy, replace her with Valerie, and continue the empire she had built for him. But he had never truly understood the foundation upon which that empire was built. Eleanor's calm gaze never left Charles as he tried to regain control of the narrative. His eyes flicked nervously toward Valerie, who was now standing at a distance, her expression unreadable. Valerie had been so sure of her place at the top, so certain that she was the face of the brand, that she hadn't seen this coming. I don't need to remind you, Charles, Eleanor continued, her voice steady, that Hayes and Lawson was built on trust, on vision, on creativity, not on manipulation and deceit. She took a slow breath, allowing the words to sink in. And I've always had the final say. Charles's face went pale as the weight of her statement hit him. The truth was far worse than he had imagined. The board had been swayed by his influence. The press had fed off his narrative, and Valerie had been eager to step into a role that she had no true claim to. But in that moment, all of it unraveled. Eleanor didn't need to shout to make her presence felt. She didn't need to make a scene. She simply needed to remind them all of who she was and what she had built. Her legacy was not something that could be erased by a man's pride or a woman's ambition. It was something that would outlast them both. Eleanor's words carried through the crowd like a wave, sweeping over the guests who had once looked down on her, dismissed her, or underestimated her. The whispers, the laughter, the pity, they all faded into the background. All that remained was the quiet power of a woman who had never truly given up, who had never let go of what was rightfully hers. As the cameras clicked and flashed, Eleanor handed over a piece of paper to Simone, her expression unwavering. "I have the legal documentation to back up everything I've said," she said quietly. "I've been waiting for the right moment to make it public. And now that moment has arrived." Simone, her excitement palpable, looked down at the document, her fingers trembling as she read. Her eyes widened with realization as she looked up at Eleanor. "This is incredible," she breathed. "You're going to take back control of the company?" Eleanor nodded, her voice calm. "I never lost it. I just had to wait." The gala was now a spectacle, but not the one Charles or Valerie had hoped for. The press turned their attention away from the young, glamorous mistress and focused on the quiet, composed woman who had just revealed herself to be the true force behind Hayes and Lawson. The evening had started with mockery and ridicule, but would end with Eleanor reclaiming not just her company, but her dignity. As the night wore on, the reporters continued to follow her every move. Eleanor, however, didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already made her statement, and the world was about to see just how powerful she truly was. The morning after the gala, the world had changed. The viral photos from the event spread like wildfire across social media, news outlets, and fashion blogs. The headlines once focused on Valerie DuPont's golden gown and her carefully crafted image, now centered around one simple truth. Eleanor Hayes was a true face of Hayes and Lawson, not her ex-husband Charles, and certainly not his young mistress. The quiet woman in the simple dress had emerged from the shadows, exposing the fragility of the empire built on her back. By noon, every major fashion publication was scrambling to confirm the details of Eleanor's quiet return to power. Journalists who had once ignored her were now reaching out for interviews, for statements. But Eleanor wasn't interested in interviews. She wasn't interested in the spectacle. She had a different plan, one that had been in the works for months, even years. Eleanor sat in her office, the room quiet except for the sound of her fingers tapping gently on the surface of the desk. The office was simple, nothing like the extravagant suites her husband had once occupied. The furnishings were understated, reflecting her taste for timeless elegance. Yet in the quiet simplicity of the room, power lingered. The kind of power that couldn't be bought or built overnight. It had been earned, piece by piece, over the course of 25 years. Across from her, Margaret Lawson sat, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. Margaret had been the co-founder of Hayes and Lawson, and despite her decision to step away from the brand years ago, she had kept a close eye on its trajectory. She knew what Eleanor had built. She knew the passion, the vision, and she knew that the brand had drifted far from its roots under Charles's leadership. "Do you think the board will accept this?" Margaret asked, her voice low but filled with urgency. "They don't have a choice," Eleanor replied, her voice steady, filled with the quiet confidence that had been so evident the night before. "I'm the majority owner. They don't even know it yet." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You think they're going to let you just waltz in and take back control after all this time?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile. "I don't need to waltz in, Margaret. I've been here the whole time. They just didn't see me." Eleanor had never truly disappeared from Hayes and Lawson. She had let the world believe she had faded into the background, quietly accepting the role of the supportive wife, the mother who stepped aside to let her husband lead. But in truth, she had always been involved, more involved than anyone realized. She had kept her finger on the pulse of the company, even when Charles had taken the reins. He had thought she had given up, that she had let him take over. But she hadn't. She had built a legacy, and she wasn't about to let it be destroyed. The phone rang, breaking the silence of the room. Eleanor glanced at the caller ID, her eyes narrowing slightly. It was Charles. She answered the call with a calm voice. "Hello, Charles." His voice was sharp, tinged with panic. "What the hell is going on? Eleanor? What do you think you're doing? You've made a mockery of everything we built." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "We built nothing, Charles. You hijacked everything I created. I'm still the CO," he spat. "You don't have any say in this anymore." "I think you're mistaken," Eleanor replied, her voice steady but firm. "I've always had the final say." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Eleanor could hear him breathing, his frustration palpable. "Where are you going with this?" Charles demanded, his voice breaking through the tension in the room. "Are you really going to try to take everything from me?" From James. Eleanor's heart clenched slightly at the mention of their son. James was the one thing that had always grounded her, the one thing she had never been willing to compromise on. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring what was rightfully hers, what was rightfully James's. "I'm not taking anything from you, Charles," she said quietly. "I'm taking back what I built, and I'm doing it for James." The conversation ended abruptly, but Eleanor knew it was just the beginning. Charles had spent years convincing himself that he was the one responsible for Hayes and Lawson's success. He had rewritten their history, twisted the narrative, and positioned himself as the savior of the brand. But now the truth was out, and he had no idea how to handle it. Eleanor, on the other hand, was calm, strategic, patient. She had no intention of rushing things. The next step was crucial, the board meeting. She had to make sure that the people who had once trusted her, who had helped her build Hayes and Lawson from the ground up, knew exactly what she was capable of. 2 days later, the emergency board meeting was set to take place. Eleanor arrived early, the room already filled with the familiar faces of old colleagues, some of whom had remained loyal to her vision over the years. Others, of course, had sided with Charles, convinced that he was the future of the company. Eleanor knew this was going to be a battle, one that required more than just the legal documents she had brought with her. As she walked into the room, the tension was palpable. Every eye was on her, but no one dared to speak. She took her seat at the head of the table, her expression calm, her posture confident. She was ready. Charles stormed into the room a few minutes later, his face flushed with anger. He wasted no time in addressing the board, his voice raised in an attempt to regain control. "This is absurd," he began, his gaze shifting from one board member to the next. "Eleanor hasn't been involved with this company in years. She has no right to claim ownership now." Eleanor waited for him to finish before she spoke. Her voice was steady, cutting through the chaos in the room. "Actually, I do have the right, Charles. And I'm here to remind everyone that I've always been a majority owner of Hayes and Lawson, not you." The board fell silent. Charles's face turned white as the reality of her words began to sink in. He opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor raised a hand, signaling for him to stop. "I've come here today to restore Hayes and Lawson to what it was always meant to be," she continued. "A brand that values craftsmanship, integrity, and understated elegance, not just another corporate entity for profit." The tension in the room shifted, some board members nodding in agreement, others still unsure of how to respond. But Eleanor could feel the shift. She had the power, and now she was going to use it. As the meeting continued, it became clear that Charles's grip on the company was slipping. His allies in the room began to waver, the doubts settling in as they saw Eleanor's unwavering resolve. By the end of the session, the vote was called, and Charles's reign was officially over. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But Eleanor Hayes had taken back control of Hayes and Lawson, and she had done it on her own terms. The morning after the board meeting, the news spread like wildfire. The press had caught wind of the major shakeup at Hayes and Lawson, and the headlines screamed of Eleanor's quiet, strategic takeover. Eleanor Hayes reclaims her empire. One major outlet declared, "Ex-wife takes back control of iconic fashion brand." Another headline read, "The narrative had shifted. The quiet woman in the simple dress had become the true face of the brand, and now the world was watching to see what she would do next." Eleanor, however, was focused. The battle with Charles was far from over. He might have lost his position as CEO, but his influence in the fashion world, and especially within the media, was far-reaching. He wouldn't give up without a fight. But Eleanor had never been one to rush into battle. She knew that this next phase required careful, deliberate moves. The brand she had built was on the brink of an exciting new chapter, and she was determined to make it true to its roots. It would take more than just legal documents and boardroom victories. It was time to take the fight to the public, and to Charles himself. The first step was clear. Eleanor had to secure her position in the eyes of the public. Hayes and Lawson couldn't just be seen as a brand reclaimed by its rightful owner. It had to be seen as something renewed, something more than what it had become under Charles's control. She needed to demonstrate that Hayes and Lawson's soul hadn't been sold off for profit. That meant one thing, a public statement, a bold, undeniable show of what the brand stood for. Eleanor had already started working on it the moment she had taken back control. She reached out to the original artisans, the ones who had been pushed aside in favor of cheaper alternatives. She reconnected with the designers who had helped shape Hayes and Lawson into the respected name it had once been. They would create a collection, not for sale, but as a statement. This collection would be a tribute to everything Hayes and Lawson had stood for in the beginning. Quiet luxury, timeless designs, and craftsmanship that spoke for itself. The press conference was set for the following week. Eleanor stood before the cameras, poised and confident. The room was filled with reporters, photographers, and fashion insiders, all eager to hear what the woman who had just orchestrated one of the most unexpected corporate turnarounds in recent history had to say. Charles had already issued his own statement, of course. He had tried to paint Eleanor's actions as desperate, as a last-ditch attempt to regain control of a company she had long since abandoned. But Eleanor knew the truth, and so did the people who mattered. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I want to start by reminding you all of why Hayes and Lawson was created in the first place. It wasn't just about selling clothes. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about creating something that lasted, something that mattered, something that made women feel powerful without needing to prove anything to anyone." She paused, letting her words sink in. "For the past few years, I've watched my vision slowly be eroded. Hayes and Lawson became a brand that no longer reflected the values we started with. It became about money. It became about flash. It became about something other than the craft. That ends today." A murmur ran through the room, and for the first time, Eleanor felt the weight of her decision settle around her like a shield. This was the moment she had waited for, the moment she would prove that her legacy was more than just a business. It was a philosophy, a way of being that couldn't be destroyed by anyone, not even by her own husband. "I'm proud to announce that Hayes and Lawson will be returning to its roots," she continued. "Our upcoming collection, which will be released later this year, will showcase everything we once stood for. It will be a celebration of craftsmanship quality and timeless elegance. No logos, no flashy statements, just beautiful clothes made with care. The cameras flashed, but Eleanor remained calm, unwavering. This was her moment of victory, not over Charles, but over the forces that had tried to drown out her vision. She wasn't just reclaiming a company. She was reclaiming her identity. As the press conference ended, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction. The battle was far from over, but she had struck a powerful blow. The fashion world was listening. They had no choice but to pay attention to the woman who had quietly stood at the helm all along. The rest of the day passed in the blur of phone calls and meetings. The press was hungry for more, and the buzz around Hayes and Lawson was building. Eleanor had already started making plans for the future. Plans that would solidify her position as the true leader of the brand. But even as the momentum continued to shift in her favor, she knew that there was still work to be done. The press might have embraced her story for now, but Charles was not the type to accept defeat easily. He would fight back, using whatever influence he had left. But Eleanor was prepared for that, too. As she sat in her office, reviewing documents and making calls, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The company was hers again, but more importantly, she had reclaimed herself. This fight hadn't been about revenge. It had been about restoration. Her company, her legacy, and most importantly, her voice. Later that evening, Charles called again. This time, his tone was colder, more desperate. Eleanor, you've made your statement, but you don't own Hayes and Lawson anymore. The board supports me. The press supports me. You can't just waltz back in here and pretend you're in control. Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. I already have control, Charles. You just didn't notice. And you were too arrogant to see it until now. You've made a mistake, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I'll make sure the world knows the truth. You're nothing without me. I'll destroy everything you've built. Eleanor's expression remained neutral. You can try, she said softly, but you won't succeed. As the conversation ended, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her mind already planning the next move. Charles might have been a man in the spotlight for the last few years, but he had underestimated her. He had underestimated the quiet power that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. And Eleanor knew, deep down, that the next chapter of Hayes and Lawson was just beginning. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. The media had seized on Eleanor's bold return, and the world, especially the fashion world, was hungry for more. Headlines continued to circulate, with the public fascinated by her quiet strength and strategic precision. Eleanor Hayes was no longer just a name associated with Hayes and Lawson. She was now a symbol of resilience, a reminder that true power wasn't always loud and flashy. It was deliberate, thoughtful, and poised. The online reaction was overwhelming. Social media, which had once been a tool for her husband's flashy image, now amplified Eleanor's voice. Posts, memes, and articles praised her for taking back control of her company and reminding the world of the brand's true essence. Eleanor had become an unlikely hero to many, an example of a woman reclaiming her rightful place after years of being sidelined. But, as with any major victory, there were those who would never be content to let her remain at the helm. Eleanor had expected Charles's reaction, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. His threats, once empty, had begun to take shape. The following week, Eleanor received an anonymous tip. Charles was meeting with investors who were still loyal to him, attempting to rally support for a hostile takeover. He had made it clear that he wasn't going down without a fight. Her thoughts shifted to James, their son, as she sat in her office late one evening. He had grown up amidst the power struggles of the business world, and while she had always shielded him from the worst of it, he could no longer be insulated from the reality of what was happening. Eleanor couldn't let this corporate war destroy everything she had built, not just for her own sake, but for his as well. It wasn't just Charles who posed a threat to Eleanor's reign. It was the people who had come to believe in his leadership, the board members who had once served her, trusted her vision, had now been swayed by his influence. They saw Charles as a man who could take Hayes and Lawson into the future, someone who could bring in new investors, increase the brand's market share, and push it into new territories. But they had missed the essence of the brand, its soul. Eleanor had created something more than just a fashion line. She had created a movement, a community that stood for elegance, quality, and craftsmanship. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way. Business is personal, and when it's built on vision and heart, it's never truly yours to give away. The next move was clear. Eleanor knew she couldn't rely on the board alone. She needed to take control, not just of the company, but of the narrative. To do that, she needed to secure her financial position in a way that couldn't be undone. She spent the next several days meeting with the most influential names in the industry, designers, investors, and PR experts, laying the groundwork for a new campaign that would redefine the brand. But this time, it wouldn't be about flashy ad campaigns or celebrity endorsements. It would be about authenticity. The next collection would focus on classic, timeless pieces, honoring the artisans who had helped build Hayes and Lawson. The aim wasn't just to sell clothes. It was to restore the brand's image as the epitome of quality, a label that represented more than just money, but culture, craftsmanship, and a sense of true artistry. But even as she made progress behind the scenes, the storm with Charles continued to gather. 2 weeks after the press conference, Eleanor attended a high-profile fashion event, an exclusive gathering of the industry's top designers, investors, and influencers. It was here that she would make her next move. The event had been a key opportunity for Charles to solidify his position in the industry, but Eleanor would not let him take it from her. She was determined to reclaim her place at the forefront. The event was set in a luxurious venue, a private estate just outside of Manhattan. The elegant space was filled with glistening chandeliers and a hushed atmosphere that mirrored the exclusive nature of the gathering. Eleanor, dressed in a striking black dress with simple, classic lines, made her way through the room. Her calm demeanor, coupled with the unmistakable confidence that had been slowly building in her, drew eyes wherever she went. She wasn't the invisible woman anymore. At the far end of the room, she saw Charles with a small group of investors, laughing a little too loudly, trying to keep his charm up as he attempted to sell them on the future of Hayes and Lawson. The mistress, Valerie, stood beside him, her expression one of mild indifference, as though this was all just part of the game. But Eleanor knew it was much more than that. Valerie wasn't just playing a part in the story. She was an active player in this corporate war, and Eleanor wasn't about to let her take the spoils. Eleanor approached Charles, her steps measured but purposeful. As she drew near, the conversation around Charles and the investors faltered. His smile faded as he saw her approach, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. "Eleanor," Charles said with a tight smile, though his eyes betrayed his annoyance, "I didn't expect to see you here. What's this, your attempt to keep up appearances?" Eleanor's smile was small but powerful. "I've always kept up appearances, Charles. It's you who forgot what this brand stood for." The investors exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the tension between them. Eleanor knew they had come to expect these power struggles between her and Charles. But this time, things were different. She wasn't just a passive observer in her own brand anymore. She was taking it back. "I'm here to remind you," Eleanor continued, her voice steady, "that Hayes and Lawson belongs to me, and it always will." Charles's expression darkened. "You're delusional. You can't just waltz back in and expect everything to be the same. The board won't back you, and you don't have the control you think you do." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her voice never wavering. "That's where you're wrong, Charles. I do have control. You may have the media on your side for now, but the truth has already come out. People know who built this brand. People know who put the work in." She glanced at Valerie, who was now watching the exchange of a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. And people know who tried to erase that legacy. For a moment, the room went quiet. The other investors stood still, unsure what to make of the standoff before them. It was clear that Eleanor wasn't backing down, and she wasn't going to let Charles spin his version of the story any longer. By the end of the evening, Eleanor had secured meetings with key investors who had been loyal to her vision. The battle was far from over, but she had taken another step toward regaining control, solidify her place at the head of the company once again. Charles, meanwhile, found himself in a precarious position, his once unwavering support slipping, his network of allies dwindling. As she left the estate, Eleanor's thoughts shifted to the next phase. The fight was now more than just about control. It was about restoring the soul of Hayes and Lawson. And with each strategic move, she was carving out her future, not as the ex-wife or the sideline figure, but as the leader who would redefine her legacy. And she would do it on her own terms. The final showdown loomed. The weeks following Eleanor's strategic triumphs were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and late nights spent crafting her next move. She had already won several key battles, securing investors who supported her vision, regaining control of her brand, and solidified her place as the rightful owner of Hayes and Lawson. But one battle remained. The war with Charles was not over yet. It wasn't just about reclaiming control of the company. It was about proving once and for all that her vision was the true heart of Hayes and Lawson. It was about showing the world that the brand could rise above the chaos Charles had created, that it could return to its roots, craftsmanship, elegance, and authenticity. The next step, however, would require more than just corporate maneuvering. It would require Eleanor to put everything on the line, her legacy, her name, and her future. The board meeting was set for the following month, an emergency session that would decide the ultimate fate of Hayes and Lawson. Charles had pulled out every stop to secure his position, rallying investors and pushing the media to spin the narrative in his favor. But Eleanor knew it would take more than a media campaign to win this battle. It would take a declaration, a statement of not just her authority, but of her vision for the future. As the day of the meeting approached, Eleanor felt a familiar stir of nerves in her chest. She had been through corporate battles before, but this one was different. This wasn't just about a business. This was about everything she had worked for, the brand that had become her identity, the company that had been built on her sweat, her passion, her ideas. She couldn't let it slip away. But she wasn't going to fight this war alone. She had already secured the support of key board members and investors who had long respected her, who knew the real story behind the success of Hayes and Lawson. Now, she needed to use her influence to sway the remaining skeptics. The day of the meeting arrived. The conference room was large and imposing, the kind of room designed for power plays, where every word spoken could shift the balance of the future. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her expression composed. She had done the work, made the necessary calls, and now it was time for the final act. Charles entered the room with Valerie at his side, his usual confident smile replaced with a tense frown. He had been blindsided by Eleanor's strategic moves over the past month, and the uncertainty in his eyes was evident. He was no longer the man in control, but he was determined to keep up the facade. Valerie, ever the image-conscious mistress, stood close beside him, a symbol of the new life he had tried to build without her. Eleanor watched them both with a quiet, calculating gaze. This moment wasn't about revenge. It was about control and restoring the integrity of her brand. "I called this meeting to discuss the future of Hayes and Lawson." Eleanor began, her voice firm but calm. "We've been through a lot, and it's time for us to move forward. I've been patient. I've allowed things to play out, but the time for compromise is over." Charles scoffed, leaning forward in his seat. "You've already made your little speech for the media, Eleanor. What more do you want?" Eleanor's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. What I want is simple, Charles. I want the board to recognize that Hayes and Lawson belongs to me. I'm not here to play games anymore. I'm not here to sit in the background while you continue to use my name to push your vision of what the brand should be. Charles opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor raised a hand, cutting him off. This brand was never about you, Charles, she continued. And it's certainly not about Valerie. It was about a vision, my vision. A vision of quality, craftsmanship, and authenticity. You lost sight of that. You lost the soul of Hayes and Lawson. The room was silent as her words hung in the air. Valerie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly aware that she was not the focus of this battle. Eleanor's eyes never left Charles, who was visibly rattled. This was not the narrative he had fought for. This was a reality he couldn't escape. I've spoken to the investors, Eleanor continued, her voice cutting through the tension. I've secured their backing, and I have the legal documents to prove that I am the rightful majority owner. The board no longer has a choice. This meeting is to decide the future of Hayes and Lawson, and I intend to steer it in the direction it was always meant to go. The next few hours were filled with heated exchanges. Charles tried to rally support from the few remaining board members loyal to him, but it was clear that his influence was waning. He had lost the trust of the people who had once been his allies, and now his attempts to manipulate the room fell flat. Eleanor, calm and composed, presented her vision for the future, a return to the brand's roots, a commitment to quality, craftsmanship, and authenticity, of refocusing on the values that had made Hayes and Lawson the powerhouse. It was before Charles had taken control. She outlined the strategy for the upcoming collection, the rebranding efforts, and the partnership she had secured with major influencers who truly represented the brand's ethos. The final vote was called. Eleanor watched as the board members cast their votes, one by one. The tension in the room was palpable as the final tally was made. By a majority vote, the board member said, Eleanor Hayes is hereby reinstated as CEO of Hayes and Lawson. The moment was surreal, almost cinematic. Charles sat frozen in his seat, his face ashen. Valerie's mouth was slightly open, disbelief written across her face. They had lost. Eleanor stood slowly, her eyes sweeping across the room. She didn't need to say anything else. The room knew, the world knew, the power had shifted back to where it had always belonged. As the board members applauded, Eleanor's thoughts turned to James. This wasn't just about corporate control. It was about securing the future for him, for her legacy. She had done it. She had taken back what was rightfully hers. And this time, there was no one who could take it from her. Charles stormed out of the room, his anger barely contained. Valerie followed behind him, her head held high, but her eyes betrayed her confusion. They had lost the game, and they knew it. But Eleanor didn't care about them anymore. She cared about what came next. The future of Hayes and Lawson, a future that was rooted in her vision, her work, and the brand she had built from the ground up. This was only the beginning.